Hi, my name is Andrea Kupfer-Schneider, Professor of Law and Director of the Institute for Women's Leadership at Marquette University. In honor of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and in recognition of how important women are in this current election, we are delighted to bring you our virtual conference on women's suffrage and innovation. All of our keynote speeches and panel conversations are available on our website. The panel conversation you are about to see was taped live on October 16th. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome everybody as we dive into this 12 o'clock session. Just wanted to let everybody know verbally we are recording this session and it will be posted live or posted later in our social media feeds. If you take the next few seconds to complete your poll answers, we'll get right on started with Kristen Foster from Marquette. Take it away, Kristen.
Thank you. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our final day of Marquette University's Institute for Women's Leadership Conference on Women's Suffrage and Innovation. You can find all our panels, if you haven't seen them yet, on our conference webpage. In honor of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, today's first panel, Suffrage, Changing the Narrative and Why It Matters, offers an opportunity for all of us to think in new ways about how we might teach and tell the story of the women's suffrage movement, our own centennial reassessment. We will open the panel for questions towards the end, but please feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A while we are talking for the first 40 or so minutes. Our team will try to get these to us quickly in the final segment, and we will respond to as many of them as we are able. You can also hide non-video participants if you'd like by hovering over the three dots in the corner, and you'll be able to see that option and adjust there. So I am Kristen Foster, Associate Professor of History here at Marquette University, and I am delighted to introduce first my colleague Lisa Tetrault from Carnegie Mellon University. Sarah?
I'm Sarah Wadsworth, English professor at Marquette University, and I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Atiba Ellis, professor of law at the Marquette University Law School.
So first we're going to look a little bit at offering ways to think about redesigning the narrative of the women's suffrage movement by discussing the diversity of the movement itself. So the suffrage movement has developed into a rather fixed narrative, generally starting with Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. It moves through the split in this suffrage movement over the 15th Amendment and then onward towards the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Lisa, your work challenged the origin story of Seneca Falls, and we're seeing this summer especially in some new books that are coming out, exciting scholarship about rethinking the single movement and really imagining instead many movements doing the work for women's suffrage. So finally the question, who are some of the women who are left out of this narrative, and what channels do they develop and deploy on behalf of change? And we can also certainly engage why including these women matters at this point. So this can go to anyone.
The dreaded mute error. Hello, everyone, and I'm delighted to be joining Professor Ellis today and Professor Foster and Professor Wadsworth. Thank you for the invitation. The question's a good one, Kristen, and I think that the focus is both diversifying who we look at, but also, as you say, diversifying not just the who, but the what. Because the movement no longer really holds together as a singular story anymore. And when we do hold the movement together as a singular story, it's really a white women's story. And that has, in a way, distracted from all of the ways in which disenfranchisement continues as a practice all the way through until today. Because when we tell it as a 1848 to 1920 story, It is largely a white story. It's largely a story of democratic triumph, kind of isolated from all of the democratic suppression going on at exactly the same time. And largely not a story of the democratic suppression that goes on after 1920. So in all kinds of ways, if we're going to be equipped to understand voting rights in the present, we must diversify the story of the past in order to understand the world we live in now, which is not one where all women are guaranteed a right to vote, as one would often claim about the 19th Amendment. And as we saw claimed many, many, many times throughout, you know, if you do a Google search, you will be bombarded by it. And if you do, you know, the sort of traditional centennial cruising, you will be bombarded by it as well. But as Professor Ellis's own work on disenfranchisement underscores, there are all kinds of ways in which women are disenfranchised today. And so I think that we have to move beyond this idea of the movement, something called suffrage movement, and think more broadly, as many scholars like Martha Jones and Catherine Cahill and plenty of others, Catherine Marino and others are doing, and arguing that really what we have to look at is kind of women in voting. And the suffrage movement is really only one chapter of that much larger story, not the chapter. So that would move us to looking at the ways in which Black women have positioned their activism, Native women have positioned their activism, often in completely outside of and defined very differently than white women's organizing. Because to even call, and this is the last thing I'll say, but to even call yourself a woman suffragist is a position of tremendous racial privilege, right? Because to isolate yourself as just a woman and to isolate yourself as interested in just one question, you know, suffrage, is something that most women did not have the luxury of doing. That doesn't mean that they weren't interested in voting. They were keenly interested in voting, but they understood it as part of a much broader project. And so often we haven't seen those women because they didn't identify themselves in the way that we have gone looking for them, the way they're organized in the archive. So there have been all kinds of new work coming out. Martha Jones just wrote a book trying to trace this story, just jettisoning the 1848 to 1920 narrative and looking at what would it look like if we found Black women where they are? What would that narrative look like? And she tells one from 1820 to 2020. Kathleen Cahill does one where she talks about Indigenous women, Latina women, and others whose fight, Chinese American women whose fight extended well beyond the 1848 to 1920 thing. And then Catherine Marino's work looking at how this wasn't even contained, her work, Feminism in the Americas, wasn't even contained within inside national boundaries in many ways. So in all those ways, the movement's exploding, not just by finding new people inside of it, but getting rid of the it, or at least diversifying the it. So.
And maybe saying that different women had different ways of approaching the it. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they would define the pride very, very differently than white women did. Yeah.
So I want to pick up on this theme and take it, I guess, from the perspective of where I sit in terms of teaching the right to vote and thinking about the theory of what it means to pass the 19th Amendment itself. But first of all, I want to join my colleague's commentary here. I think it's absolutely right to recognize, in a sense, that the kind of identity politics silos that come up when we just sort of encapsulate the movement for women's suffrage as just a movement. And certainly implicit in all this is all of the siloing and contestation within the effort to gain those rights that happen, especially with the split around the 15th Amendment and what ended up being Black male enfranchisement, and the fact that that enfranchisement only lasted half a generation, and sort of the reassertion of political tyranny that came through Jim Crow. But what I want to speak to is sort of the orientation of thinking about this as claiming rights and as developing a right to vote. There is a mythos of universal suffrage that is an inevitable trajectory, and oftentimes the conventional narratives around this in terms of both historians and political scientists and legal scholars analyzing this in this sort of siloed way end up just treating this as a stopping place in terms of the long and, dare I say, inevitable march to universal suffrage, right? But that narrative in terms of the conversation that I focus on in my scholarship in terms of the dialogue between the courts and the people claiming rights and the infrastructure that seeks to retain its power, certainly there is pushback, and that pushback gets that pushback gets lost if the narrative simply focuses on, well, there was a gain and that gain is in and of itself static, and therefore we can treat it that way, and as if there is, you know, one goes up one more step up a ladder without realizing that one can slide back down. And in essence, the stakes aren't about, they are about women, but they are also about women situated in a particular political community that was constructed around race and gender and the types of identity politics and positioning politics that are continually flowing and dynamic in this context. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, the whole notion of what rights were created when the 19th Amendment was ratified gets watered down. And certainly within my field, Reva Siegel has been sort of amplifying and putting a light on the actual sort of revolutionary work of equality building that happens when we actually sort of think more richly and with a broader imagination about what work did the 19th Amendment do. And in effect, it then becomes a story of recognizing that the rights implicit in the text of the amendment are actually quite expansive. And certainly Rick Hazen and Lisa Lightman have also written a paper that compares thin and thick conceptions of the 19th Amendment. And the ultimate arc of this argument is that the 19th Amendment, like the 15th Amendment that came before and the constitutional amendments that came after, if we took a more expansive view of those amendments, certainly a lot of the disputes that we're worried about today concerning voter suppression and concerning the primacy of the power of the federal government and the federal constitution to remedy things as basic as where drop boxes get put to collect, you know, absentee ballots and these sorts of questions, that in essence, there is actually a stronger federal constitutional conception around these things and that it should be pursued as such. But part of the counter narrative in this sense is the fact that our reading of the rights created gets watered down. Our imagination around the right to vote gets impoverished when we think of it as sort of a lockstep progression. And so I think by doing the more inclusive and richer thinking about the political history around the amendment and thinking more broadly about its ramifications, we can expand the right to vote for everyone, but in particular for women.
Yeah, I so appreciate you raising the amendment itself, because I feel like that is getting and gets very lost in the centennial, which really we're not celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage, we're really celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, right? They're two very different things. Women are voting, millions of women are voting before 1920, millions of women start voting in 1920, and millions of women still aren't voting after 1920, right? So it's a story of the 19th Amendment, and Reva Siegel's work and all the rest I admire greatly. And absolutely, there are both new ways of reading who was in the movement, what a movement was, but also I think what Professor Ellis points us to is new ways of reading the 19th Amendment itself.
Mm-hmm.
And many legal scholars like Reva Siegel and others, I don't know the piece. I don't know that piece. I'll have to look it up. But I think that there is also there's also a way in which I've been speaking, trying to narrow our understanding of the monument while taking your point well, that it also needs to be broadened in a way. And the narrowing is that many people talk about it as it gave women the right to vote. The thing that it does not do, much like the 15th Amendment, is it does not create a right to vote. There is actually no right to vote in the Constitution, and this stuns people, right? Like, there is no affirmative right to. What's that?
It's the first thing I say in my election law.
Yeah, I mean, people do not understand that everyone assumes that there is a right to vote inside the Constitution that's guaranteed to a citizen. And what the 15th and 19th Amendment did was sort of let, African-American men and then let women into that right. That is not what those amendments did. What those amendments do is speak to the states. They don't even speak to the voter themselves. So what they do is they speak to the states, and they say to the states who actually get to draw up the list of who gets to vote. The Constitution does not do that. There is no right to vote in the Constitution, and still today citizens have no right to vote. It's the states that get to draw up a list of criteria by which that you have to meet in order to be a voter. And many of those states in the 1820s and the 30s all had the words white and the words male. So you had to clear both those words, right? You had to clear being male and you had to clear being white. And then the 15th Amendment strikes down race, so white gets struck down, but it doesn't enfranchise Black women because Black women are still barred by sex. And then the 19th Amendment strikes down male, strikes down sex. So what it says to the states is, on those two very narrow grounds, you may not bar voting. But what it leaves open is that the states can declare any other grounds for barring voting. They just can't do it on those two specific grounds. So what they do is they say, okay, fine, we'll pop up poll taxes, we'll pop up literacy tests. And as they do that, those ensnare are racially targeted without explicitly mentioning race. And so women who are all helped by the 19th Amendment, because the word male is struck down, but it's not sufficient because it doesn't invest women with a right to vote. It just says you can't use sex to discriminate. But you can still use poll taxes, you can still use literacy tests. Those won't be struck down, right, until the 1960s. So what we have is this also misunderstanding, I think, of constitutional governance around voting that handicaps our ability to see the complexity and the diversity of the story.
And what's really interesting about this, just to sort of, the interstitial gap in what you just said is that what the original Constitution says about voting is explicitly that states, within the context of federal elections, which implies that states are a sovereign in and of themselves, right? And they run state elections, and the Constitution has this Republican form of governance clause that assumes that some form of a democratic republic will exist in each state, which in and of itself is a contested notion, at least at the very early end of the republic. But that aside, the elections clause says, when it comes to federal elections, states get to determine who the electors, i.e. the voters, are for the election for the House of Representatives, right? This is in Article 1 of the Constitution. And so, states are seen as so the arbiter. And, the original Constitution basically says we'll go along with whatever state law says. And not until these questions of should women be admitted and should African Americans be admitted, does that consensus start to get shaken, right? And given that, and that plus the fact that when you read those opinions where the Supreme Court ends up sort of saying, well, we are going to enforce the striking down of race, as you put it, it is striking down race in a very, the only most egregious form of racism, right? I'm thinking of Gwynn versus United States, 1915, grandfather clauses in, I believe, Oklahoma, and the court, and you read the opinion, it reads very like reluctant to say, well, this is race, sort of explicit in a grandfather clause. In other words, if your grandfather was eligible to fight in the Civil War, then you could be exempted from other voter qualifications. And that was basically targeting white men whose grandfathers fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. So this sort of technical reading of what race meant, as opposed to a far expansive reading of what race really means in terms of socioeconomic status and white supremacy, and the court's long legacy in sort of saying, well, those concerns, the federal Constitution has nothing to say. Or when it is presented, we're going to read that in the narrowest of terms. I mean, we miss all of that dynamic when we sort of fixate on the idealized notion of, okay, this is a success for the right to vote, and we don't have to think about anything else. And the point being, that dynamic keeps repeating itself today.
Yep. And I think when we attend not just to the kind of who and the what in terms of movements, but also to the legality of voting, which is where you're pointing us, Professor Ellis, and what we're talking about now, then it connects also the story to a much broader story of the unfolding of an American democracy, not just in the way that kind of silos the question of gender, but links it to the idea of how are we going to regulate and how are we going to govern voting? Because that's something that we don't spend enough time as Americans thinking through, because we just assume we know what the right to vote means. And as Professor Ellis is pointing out, it has all these gray nuances, and it's, it is denied in all kinds of ways. And the Supreme Court will consistently say, Americans have no right to vote. There is no such thing, right? And so one of the things this attention to legality of voting reminds us is that this fight is ongoing and unfinished, right? Mm-hmm. Or, what is the fight we're fighting for? We should interrogate this idea of the right to vote and not assume we know what it means, because we don't.
It also takes me back to to Mary Kelly's keynote and an earlier conversation we had about the importance of education then, because if we have these big structural issues that are really a larger question for our discussion about suffrage, people have to be educated, right? So that conversation we had about women's education being central to civic engagement, I think that continues, right? To having to understand how the Constitution works, having to understand where state governments have authority and where the federal government does. And so it seems to me, in terms of bringing in voices, I think we're finding that education also becomes an important step in the process of voting and civic engagement as well. So I think
in thinking more richly and with a broader imagination, as Dr. Ellis suggested, I'd also like to suggest that we think not just about the what and the who, but also the how and the different channels that women were using to talk about suffrage. And one of them that doesn't get a lot of attention, but as an English professor, I'm going to tell you about, is literary activism, and the way that many activists at the time, who were primarily activists, wrote novels because it had been used for a century as a really effective platform for engaging the imaginations of millions of readers. And similarly, many women who were primarily writers were very active in different suffrage organizations and other kinds of progressive movements. But I also want to take this chance to turn the conversation slightly. In our process of enriching and changing the historical narrative of the suffrage movement, as we move away from a white and top-down narrative alone, we might also have to look beyond voting laws to understand what non-white women and communities had to address. Mm-hmm. It wasn't really just about the vote, was it? what were some of the other issues that these women brought to light as they became involved in the suffrage movement?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I think one of the effects that I've talked about in my book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, and that I've talked about in my work since, is this mythology of 1848 to 1920 is a mythology that misleads us in all kinds of ways. And one is the way in which it bounds unhelpfully a much broader campaign and a much broader set of activism and a much broader set of activists. And I think a second way that it unhelpfully frames this story is to make the vote equivalent with women's rights. And so I think we really have to uncouple the idea that voting rights was kind of at the fore, or was kind of the leading edge, or was a necessary companion to, or was the real marker of, or whatever it might be, women's rights in the 19th century. It wasn't. But the mythology of Seneca Falls and others have tried to elevate, and it was partly the work of the myth of Seneca Falls, as Stanton and Anthony created it after the American Civil War, well after the event itself, was to try to elevate the vote in a very contested terrain, whereby a lot of women were saying, that is not our first priority, right? And not only that, it's not our only priority. And so absolutely, for many women, the vote just simply didn't elevate itself to the most important or the only issue that they needed to be working on. And I think it's less that we have to understand the what else along with the vote is just like, quit letting the vote stand in for women's rights, right? And just start telling that as like, there's the vote, and then there's this whole story of women's rights. And these are sort of Venn diagrams that overlap in some places, and they're Venn diagrams that don't overlap in other places. And absolutely, there were so many women in the 19th century who were arguing for all kinds of things, including sex radicals who were arguing that men ought to be responsible for birth control and that women ought to have a right to a free and express sexuality and change their partners and divorce their husbands and, and take lovers as they wished. And, this was scandalous in the 19th century. Women who argued that, sovereignty over their body was absolutely essential. Was much more important than having a kind of political fetish, as Emma Goldman or others might call it. Other people would argue that, ending racism in the United States was, a broad-based and necessary move before anybody's voting rights could even count in a meaningful way. Ending slavery. I mean, there are just so many things that were women's rights agendas. Having voice inside your own community was often a really important agenda. Oftentimes civil rights activism got defined in very male ways. And so sometimes a women's rights agenda would be to sort of, find voice within that activism. So yeah, I mean, we could spend the next several hours inventorying all the women's rights of this era. So I don't necessarily want to go down that path so much as just to underscore that we must stop using these things synonymously. They are not synonymous.
And I hear this, and I'm hearing that the conversation about women's rights is a conversation about who belongs in the political community and what empowerment do the people within the community get to have, and to me, this is the story of America, right? I think that, and I'm just thinking about, I wrote, and this will be a weird analogy, but bear with me for just a second. Early in some of my own work, I, wrote about what I've called, and borrowing from others, called political personhood. And sort of defining personhood as the sort of ongoing work that courts have been doing, and that one way of framing this broad narrative is sort of who gets personhood, in essence, is a matter of being tiered and a matter of, there are some levels and one can go up a level, down a level, and what have you. To me, the trajectory here in terms of opening up this myriad of rights conversations is about opening up to the question of who gets to decide what rights one gets to have. And not in this doctrinaire sense, but in the broader sense of, do I get my autonomy? Do I get my choices as to who I get to interrelate with. I mean, all of these things are foundational to, you know, conversations that I think for many of us today are, you know, taken as a given, that are, you know, sort of in our head resolved. And in a sense, part of the deception of thinking about the 19th Amendment in such a sort of impoverished way, and thinking about the struggle for women's suffrage as such a mythic beginning, middle, and end, is to think that, well, that's resolved, there's nothing else to talk about. And the whole nothing else to talk about problem, I think, persists in a lot of ways, not only in terms of women's equality and thinking about the scope and the evolution of feminism, but in all the other places where membership in political community is contested.
And I think just coming off that, I think that even as people are thinking about political communities, I think that almost forces us post-19th Amendment to engage with ways that women are not included, right? I think Professor Tetrault suggested this earlier, as did you, the people on the margins of political engagement, not engagement, but political inclusion. Issues of indigenous sovereignty, right? So in the 19th Amendment does not enfranchise Native women. Citizenship is another way of excluding women from the vote. So Asian Americans, even if they were here, really don't get that protection until 43 and 52. And of course, this is even at the federal level. So before the states are disenfranchising with Jim Crow laws and voter poll taxes and things like that, even the federal government has these ways of keeping people from becoming citizens or keeping indigenous people from being recognized as citizens well after that 19th Amendment. And so in some ways that, maybe not yet, but if we want to talk about the Voting Rights Act, even in 1965, becoming this piece of legislation that brings more people into that voting community, I think that's a moment that kind of brings along these people who were left out of that 19th Amendment in 1920.
Yeah, let me just throw in there, though, that I think we do have to be careful, because I think another thing that the myth of 1848 to 1920 does is make that seem on its face desirable and the goal. And for many people, that political personhood and that kind of talisman of state recognition is something they have no interest in, and that's not where they want to find rights. So I think we have to, when we're talking about the people on the margin, the goal for the people on the margin often is not to get that talisman of political personhood, or to, and there's a way in which we normalize and kind of mainstream the system when we see that as the main goal, right? That is definitely freedom and emancipation. And there were a bunch of people on the margins who argued that is not freedom and that is not emancipation, right? I don't want it. And for many indigenous Americans, that was absolutely the argument, because that was colonization, right? They wanted sovereignty. They didn't want to be let into 1920 because that meant they were going to lose tribal sovereignty. And so this was a debate inside indigenous communities about whether or not seeking the vote was even a revolutionary or empowering act. In many ways, getting the vote, right, which in a kind of white normative world is a good, is for many people not a good, right? And wasn't necessarily like if we, you know, colonized Hawaii, you know, I mean, so for many people, they're like, oh, you gave us the right to vote? Wow, you took away our entire, you know, it's like, oh, gee, thanks. You know, I mean, it's not really like, it's not, so I think we have to be very careful too, that we don't buy into the idea. And there were, that this is just automatically on the face of a desirable and good thing, because, and there were lots of people who were, you know, rejected nationhood and rejected sort of the system as not sufficiently representative of a kind of revisionist and emancipatory and liberation politics, and that wasn't where they wanted to place their eggs, was in the system. And I think of, you know, just to take a mainstream example of that, Emma Goldman, who, you know, anarchists, labor radicalist, sex radicalist, Russian a Jewish immigrant to the United States, who basically says, you know, if voting had the kind of transformative, incredible power that people say it did, then, you know, working class men would not be in the horrible shape they're in right now because they have the power to vote. It is nothing but a co-optive tool to give you a sense of power while leaving you without actual power. And so it is seductive in that sense because it redirects you from, you know, from pursuing things that are actually transformative. Now, you may or may not reject that, but I'm just saying there were people out there who basically said, the democratic system's idea that the vote is the shiznit, you know, and the be all and end all, many people rejected that idea outright. And I think we have to remember those people too, right? That voting wasn't always something people sought. And the conferral of voting rights could be quite conservative and oppressive, you know, in the sense of indigenous communities losing sovereignty and the rest, and the ways in which it practiced colonization on people. So now, I just have to, I find Emma Goldman to be completely captivating, but I just have to push back that if the vote was not at all invested with power, then I wouldn't think that the United States would have spent most of its history trying to disenfranchise people. I do think there's a power in voting, but I think that voting has to coexist with social activism and social movements. I think that's the way in which we bring together the power of the two. But, you know, disenfranchisement, which we are in the midst of the most massive wave of voter disenfranchisement right now since before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you know, that wouldn't constantly be a theme in American history if the vote didn't matter.
Yeah, I was thinking of Zikala Sa and her, I mean, I think she moved through some of what you're talking about, but she did get to the point where she, in her mind, understood that to protect indigenous sovereignty, Native people needed the vote. That was her argument by the early 20th century.
Right, but she's not all Native people.
Right, no, I was
There were
going to
lots
say.
of people who disagreed with her, right?
Absolutely.
Like I'm saying, that was a fight inside indigenous communities about what's the best way to empower ourselves, you know, given the circumstances in which we live. And Zikala Sa, you know, Gertrude Bonin, who Kathleen Cahill writes about in Recasting the Vote, certainly came to that conclusion, but that was not a universally shared opinion inside indigenous communities, right?
So what's interesting here is this I mean, I find all of this interesting. I want to point to, you know, different communities in relation to white colonialist male subordination, you know, probably had different responses given that these communities and these individuals wanted the kind of autonomy and involvement that they got to choose on their terms, right? Being involved in the American project is challenging given that the origins of this, and especially, and I think historians have sort of dealt with colonialism in a way that that law professors haven't, and I even have a name in that regard that will take me a minute to recall, but this is a newer conversation. And in fact, I have sort of been thinking about for my own work going forward, kind of thinking about this interrelationship. And I think Professor Tetrault's observation that Native communities actually felt like being incorporated into the political community of voting creates a danger, at least raises a spark in my head, right? And one of the themes of this panel is sort of innovation. And I know I'm jumping ahead to theme 3 of what to teach the next generation, but I think that's something to sort of put a pin in right now in terms of this sort of voting and incorporation into the political community of the United States is dangerous to certain communities. I mean, but also compare, and this is another theme that I think builds on this and offers lessons that we can learn. You know, if we think of the sort of conventional narrative of the civil rights movement, you know, Brown versus Board of Education happened, Martin King leads marches, yada, yada, yada. Then we have a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act, which is its own kind of siloed and finite and impoverishedly imagined vision of social movements. I mean, one point to make right here is that by expanding our lens concerning women's suffrage and the creation of the 19th Amendment, we not only enlighten the limits of the 15th Amendment and race and voting, but we also start having this conversation about the Voting Rights Act, which we just mentioned, and how it's sort of is probably, I mean, it's touted by scholars like Guy Uriel Charles and Luis Fuentes Roher as, you know, the most effective civil rights legislation ever passed in American history.
Yep.
And a lot of that success story, I think, is based on the notion that we want to give more teeth to the commandment towards political equality on race than what America had done in the century prior to 1965. That said, when talking about this, I like to think about, you know, what the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was after, and not only echo kind of Martin Luther King's first famous speech, which was called "Give Us the Ballot," which is this meditation on how a fully empowered African American vote would actually work to transform segregation without any other moves, so long as the federal government came in and enforced the civil rights of African Americans. But I'm also thinking about like Fannie Lou Hamer, and I'm thinking about African American women activists who showed up and started to take whatever opening was provided and to run for office and to politic for more stringent voting rights and the like, right? So, you know.
Yep. And we often tell that civil rights narrative, like you say, in a siloed way, but also as a very masculine story. And what you're pointing out is there's all kinds of women inside this agitating for their voting rights, right? Inside the civil, and so the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act is in many ways the culmination of a women's fight for voting with Fannie Lou Hamer and Septima Clark and Amelia Boynton. And, you know, I mean, it goes on and on and on.
As well as the internal politics within the movement that are, you know, the civil rights movement dedicated to racial equality, but having to have contested notions of, you know, women's equality within it, you know. And so, you know, I think that this is, you know, this is all part and parcel of what gets opened up when we tell this story in a far more comprehensive way and sort of thinking more broadly about the lenses and the fact that when I say political community, in a lot of ways, I should have said political communities, right? Because I think communities and empowerment and different communities overlapping, as you know, my colleague has mentioned, is the more effective way to sort of read this narrative, right? And from my perspective, it then becomes a more effective way to think about what the intervention that the law is being asked to do when we read the 19th Amendment together with fulfilling the promise of the 15th Amendment through the Voting Rights Act and the building thereafter. I mean, part of what I think about is how, from the point of view of the courts, there was this revolutionary period. And another name to elevate is Annie Harper, who is the lead plaintiff in this case called Harper v. Virginia State Board of Elections. Annie Harper was a poor Black woman from Virginia who could not afford the $1.50 poll tax Virginia charged each year. And so she led the fight, supported by the ACLU and others, to eliminate the poll tax. And the Supreme Court ultimately did it But when you read Harper v. Virginia, you are left with this impression that this is about class and sort of neutral notions of the Equal Protection Clause that are empowering this. In other words, the court puts broad language out there about, well, you know, once states extend the right to vote, and think back to what we said at the very beginning about states being the nucleus of defining the right to vote. But once states extend the right to vote, they cannot arbitrarily then qualify the right to vote. And you know, Harper is revolutionary for stating this. And my class gets bored at me talking about Harper at length, but it's a fundamental shift. But even then, just from the point of view of voting rights, there is a certain amount of the narrative that says, well, we fixed this. We've made this pronouncement about class in voting, i.e. poll taxes having to pay for the ability to cast the ballot. But even there's a difference between a direct payment, right, having to pay a tax in exchange for getting to vote, and all the indirect costs that get imposed on voting. Mm-hmm. And so fast forward to thinking about voter identification laws and voter purges and having to wait 11 hours in line in order to cast your vote and having to exchange for that the day of work that you could have spent. Mm-hmm. You know, all of these things reveal this sort of underlying structure that gets lost if we don't think expansively about the narrative and the people involved in it and the reasons why they fought.
So how would you both, so we want to move to our, you sort of nicely moved us, Professor Ellis, to our third theme, thinking about and helping our audience today think about how we would change that narrative. So if we're teaching it, can we come up with some suggestions to folks for how to reteach that suffrage narrative, whether it's maybe we want to broaden it away from just women's suffrage and really teach more of a suffrage movement, or are there ways that we can still continue to teach a women's suffrage movement and enrich it with some of the things you both have talked about today? In the meantime, we will also be checking in with our team to bring in some questions from the audience so that they can also have your ear and get some of their questions answered.
I mean, I think in some ways we're still figuring out that question, but I can offer a couple of things that I do now in my classroom, and that is that I teach the women's suffrage movement now as kind of something called the women's suffrage movement, which really was just after which I teach as kind of a campaign for the 19th Amendment. But then I teach all the limitations of the 19th Amendment, and I talk about how women in voting is a much broader story. And then depending on which class I'm in, I also then try to link the story of women in voting to the kind of broader story of American democracy. Because the thing is, one of the other things the 1848 to 1920 story wants us to do is think that gender is an isolated variable in this story. And much of what Professor Ellis and I have been talking about is gender is not an isolated variable in this story. It is connected to all kinds of other things. And so you can't just sort of say there's gender or there's not gender, right? I mean, because for many people, these things are all bound up in all kinds of different ways, right? And so one of the other things I try to do is get them to think about how this story is not just about gender, and then also teach them that there is no right to vote and that that's not what women won. And so I think when you teach that there is no right to vote, what they won was the states may not use this one word male, then you realize there are lots of people, and they can be women, who can get caught up in other ways that the voting gets denied, which is where we are right now, right? So social movements, effectively, what social movements have won, even though we always talk about social movements having won the right to vote, what social movements have won really is the elimination of specific state restrictions, right? Striking down of those specific state restrictions. In the case of the 15th race, in the case of, oops, that was a wrong finger, the 19th, or, sex, or the poll tax, if we talk about, because I don't think we've talked enough about Annie Harper, frankly. So, but what we haven't won is stopping the states from having the ability to just dream up a whole bunch of new restrictions, which they're completely free to do, and which is exactly what they've done historically. We have had this push and pull dynamic whereby social movements come along, strike down a couple things, and we call that the right to vote, but it's not. It's just the elimination of a state restriction. Not just, it's significant, but it doesn't invest anyone with a right to vote. And what we get then is the states just popping up some more. So we have this game of whack-a-mole going on at the state level, whereby we stop them from doing one thing and then the states just do something else to strike people down from voting, which is what they're doing right now with poll taxes and no, excuse me, well, there are poll taxes in Florida, but and these in hidden poll taxes, partisan gerrymandering, closing of polling locations, faulty equipment. I mean, there's so many voter disenfranchisement techniques going on right now. And it's estimated that over 20 million people have been thrown off the voting rolls in the last couple of years. Over 20 million people. And these are people who were eligible to vote not too long ago. And that doesn't even count all the people that, should be eligible to vote if we want to go down the story of, the formerly incarcerated or other people. So what I'm trying to point out to you is that in the year that people supposedly won the right to vote, right, women, as if they're even an isolated category, they're not being disfranchised anymore on the grounds of sex, but they're being disenfranchised on the grounds of all kinds of other stuff, tens of millions, right? So I think that's an effective way to teach it too, is just to think about how have voting rights played out over US history legally. And then we can see how women fit in this narrative in all kinds of different ways, because they don't fit according to one variable of sex. They fit according to many variables. And somebody typed in, it feels like a game of whack-a-mole. And that's exactly how I've been describing it in talks I've been giving, is like, essentially the game of pursuit of voting rights has been like a game of whack-a-mole. And it's kind of swung between, the kind of whacking down of state restrictions and the rising of state restrictions. And right now we're in the middle of a rising era of state restrictions disenfranchising people. Particularly since the Voting Rights Act was struck down in 2013 in Shelby County v. Holder. So,
voting looks so different this year for a variety of reasons. And one of the questions in the chat asks what benefits we might see by making voting day a holiday so that people could vote without choosing between their jobs and voting. Or what about making voting a couple days instead of just one? I'm thinking about the barriers, the everyday barrier of people who have jobs, who have to work, and maybe people who don't have driver's licenses because they take a bus. So I'm thinking about how this historical moment with the possibility of more expansive ways to vote might help us think about those everyday obstacles that are not so much legal barriers as practical ones.
Yeah, and I think this is another way in which the 1848 to 1948 or 1920 narrative feeds into a kind of history of a triumphalist kind of understanding of American democracy. And what you're pointing to, Sarah, is the way our system is structured just in an ordinary way, not even in the kind of, state restriction way, but like, we don't have a national holiday for voting. Like that deeply depresses turnout. Is that voter disenfranchisement? We don't have automatic voter registration just uniformly across the country. Is that voter repression, right? So absolutely, there's so many things we could do in just a simple way that would not even really upset voting governance, that would make voting more accessible, would increase the robust health of our democracy. But one of the things that I'm struck by, and have been really struck by in this anniversary era and in this class I'm teaching right now on voting, is just how long the United States has had a much more robust history of not wanting to encourage voting over this idea that we embrace democracy, right? This kind of triumphalist narrative of, and now we support women voting, and now we support, and it's like that narrative, I think, hides the ways in which the United States is busy suppressing the vote all the time. So
we have a question from, oh, go ahead.
I really want to chime in right here and kind of say something really quick, but I think it exposes this problem, right? So there is, oftentimes you see what I would categorize as nonsense about people saying, well, this is a republic, not a democracy. And sort of saying, sure, we have a Republican form, right? It isn't direct democracy per se, but this then becomes a way of sort of excusing wanting to tamp down the excesses of democracy, i.e. people on the margins who want to participate, and then excusing the structures that make it more difficult for them to participate, right? And this sort of rationalization of being a democracy that can be just the right amount of anti-democratic is the through line of American history around voting in America, right? And that line gets moved, and I don't want to dismiss the sort of tangible successes, but when this gets glossed with triumphalism, then we start missing the point, and that provides cover for the disenfranchisers to do what they want to do, which is to get their voters to vote, but exclude the others who won't vote for them.
Yep.
You know.
So why haven't we, somebody asked about a movement. Have there been any movements for a national voting law, maybe an amendment to the Constitution? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, it's been introduced many times, and a movement exists right now. I think it might have even been introduced in 2019. It just doesn't ever go anywhere for all kinds of complicated reasons. But and you know, there hasn't been a robust movement for it in some ways for a whole bunch of reasons, right? It's not monocausal, but one is most people are unaware that we need one. You know, I mean, can't fight for something you think you already have.
The federal Constitution contains a right to vote. Right.
People talk about it all the time. My constitutional right to vote, you know, I'm a citizen. I have the right to vote. And it's like, well, those two things are not synonymous, actually. But yeah, I also wanted to point out that if you want to know more about the ways in which African-American women pressed for voting in the aftermath of 1920, which we often talk about this as well at enfranchised white women, but Black women, you know, were just oppressed. Like you have Martha Jones's work and also Liette Goodlow's work. I just want to give a shout out to. She's looking specifically at what Black women did on the ground after 1920, and they were raising Cain, let me tell you. So, yeah.
Since we're nearing the end of our session, I think this is a good opportunity to wrap up with Lisa's pointing us to further resources. I want to thank both of our panelists, Atiba Ellis and Lisa Tetrault, for joining us for this conversation on how to change the narrative on women's suffrage, and invite everyone to join us for the 4 o'clock session on innovoting, activism, and women's suffrage.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
On behalf of the entire Planning Committee, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Please check out the other segments of our conference on our website. And please do let us know how you utilized the resources provided. Our feedback form and email address are also located on our website. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, remember to vote.